A janitor sweeps the floors of an airport, his face hidden beneath years of hard work and faded memories. But when a wealthy businessman recognizes him, everything changes. The man who once topped every exam is now invisible to the world. But, for how long? What happens next will leave you questioning the true cost of success and the power of second chances. If you are new here, then please subscribe this channel and show thumbs up by liking the video. Now let's move to this wonderful story. The airport lounge buzzed with the usual chaos, rolling suitcases, the clatter of coffee cups, and the murmur of travelers checking their phones, their eyes glazed from red-rimmed fatigue. Amidst this, Jared Thompson sat quietly in his corner, the owner of a multi-million-dollar tech company, dressed sharply in a tailored navy suit. His fingers danced across the keyboard of his laptop, quickly switching between phone calls and emails. The world around him seemed a blur of noise and movement, a world he was used to navigating. He didn't notice the janitor at first. The man was older, probably in his mid-40s, wearing a faded green uniform and pushing a cleaning cart along the polished floors. The janitor moved through the lounge like a ghost, his steps barely making a sound on the marble tiles. He wasn't part of the world that people like Jared lived in, the world of high-powered executives and glamorous business trips. But that didn't matter to him. He was just doing his job, quietly keeping the airport clean while the world rushed past him. As Jared typed furiously, his water bottle rolled off the table, gliding across the floor. He barely noticed it at first, too absorbed in the emails piling up in his inbox. But then a voice interrupted his focus. "Excuse me, sir. Your water bottle rolled over to my side." Jared looked up, puzzled. He had almost forgotten the bottle in the rush of his work. Standing beside him was the janitor, holding the bottle, his face kind but weathered by years of hard work. Jared reached out, his fingers brushing against the bottle, but something about the man caught his attention. There was a familiarity in his eyes, something that Jared couldn't place. He frowned, his mind racing. "Wait," Jared said slowly, as his gaze shifted from the janitor's face to his worn hands and back again. "Are you David Reyes?" The janitor's expression froze for a second, his hand still extended with the bottle. There was a brief moment of silence before he nodded. "Yeah, that's me." Jared blinked, the name stirring something deep in his memory. He had known a David Reyes back in school, the kid who was always at the top of every test, every competition, every exam. The kid who never missed a single question and whose name was always at the top of the list for everything. It had been years since Jared had thought about him. You were number one in everything," Jared continued, his voice quieter now. "Science fairs, math competitions, debate club. You topped the state exams in senior year. How did you end up here?" David chuckled softly, a faint, tired smile crossing his face. He wiped his hands on the rag hanging from his belt. "That was a long time ago," he said, his voice a mix of resignation and something else, something Jared couldn't quite read. Jared studied him for a moment longer, his thoughts racing. David Reyes, the boy who had been destined for greatness, who had been predicted to do something extraordinary, was now pushing a mop across the floor of an airport lounge. "What happened?" Jared asked before he could stop himself. The question slipped out, blunt and unfiltered. He had known David for years, had been in the same classes, and yet now, seeing him in this uniform doing this job, it didn't make sense. It didn't add up. David hesitated, his smile faltering just a little. He looked down at the floor, his eyes avoiding Jared's. "Life," he said finally with a shrug. "Didn't have the right connections. My parents got sick, dropped out of college, to work. One job led to another, and you know how it goes." Jared stared at him, trying to process what he was hearing. He had always known David to be brilliant, the kind of person who could change the world. But here he was, scrubbing the floors of an airport, a man who had once been the smartest kid in the class, now living a life that seemed so far from what everyone had expected. "You had scholarships, mentors, investors," Jared said, his voice tight with disbelief. "You had all the right opportunities. David shook his head slowly, his expression unreadable. Brilliance isn't enough, Jared. Not without someone to catch you when you fall. The weight of his words hung in the air between them. Jared opened his mouth and closed it again. What could he say to that? He had never known what it was like to be without a safety net, to have doors closed because of circumstances beyond his control. He had never had to worry about what came next. Life had always been easy for him in comparison. But there was something else, something that Jared couldn't shake. The memory of the boy who had been unbeatable in everything, the kid who had always come out on top, was still there. And yet here he was, invisible to the world, cleaning floors while people like Jared walked past without a second thought. It didn't feel right. As the lounge continued to hum around them, Jared remained seated, watching David. The janitor went back to his work, pushing the mop with slow, deliberate strokes. Passengers moved past them, oblivious to the quiet man, who had once been a genius. Jared couldn't help it. He couldn't let it go. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. David deserved more than this. He deserved a chance to be remembered, to show the world what he was capable of. And Jared was determined to make that happen, no matter what it took. The thought gnawed at him as he sat there watching David work, the weight of the world on his shoulders. Something needed to change, and Jared was the one who was going to change it. Jared couldn't get the image of David out of his mind. As he sat there, the noise of the airport around him began to fade into the background, drowned out by the thoughts racing in his head. He watched as David continued to push the mop across the floor, his movements steady and routine. Jared had known this man, or at least the boy he had been, and seeing him now felt like a cruel twist of fate. How had this happened? How had a young genius, a boy who could solve problems no one else could even understand, ended up mopping floors in an airport lounge? It didn't make sense. In high school, David had been a star, an untouchable force in every subject, outshining everyone around him, including Jared. He was the kind of person everyone thought would change the world. But here he was, invisible, to the world that had once celebrated his brilliance. Jared felt a knot in his stomach. He had to know more. He had to understand how someone like David could fall so far. He couldn't just walk away from this encounter, from the memory of the boy who once aced every test and debated better than anyone else in their school. It bothered him in a way he couldn't explain. After a few moments, Jared stood up and began to follow David, unable to shake the need to ask more questions. He had to find out what had happened, what had gone wrong. There had to be more to the story than what he had heard. He found David at the back of the lounge near the employee corridor, wiping his hands on the same rag he had used earlier. It was almost like he hadn't noticed Jared following him, lost in his work. Jared hesitated, then walked up to him. "David," he said, his voice a little shaky from the tension in his chest. David looked up, clearly surprised to see Jared standing there. His eyes were tired, but there was still a glimmer of recognition in them, the same eyes that had always burned with ambition back in school. "You didn't board your flight?" David asked, his tone casual, as if he hadn't just been the center of Jared's thoughts for the past hour. "No," Jared replied, shaking his head. "I couldn't stop thinking about something." David raised an eyebrow, wiping the sweat off his brow with the back of his hand. "What's that?" "You. What happened to you?" Jared blurted out, the question slipping out before he could stop it. It felt like an intrusion, but he had to ask. "You were the best at everything, David. You were supposed to be someone. But now you're here cleaning floors." David paused, and for a moment Jared thought he might not answer. But then David chuckled softly, almost bitterly. "Life," he said, shrugging his shoulders. "Life happened. Things didn't go the way they were supposed to." Jared frowned, still not understanding. "What do you mean? You had everything. Scholarships, opportunities, mentors. You could have gone anywhere. Why didn't you?" "You don't know what it's like, Jared," David said, his voice lower now, a hint of pain in his words. "Things happen. People get sick. Parents need help. You drop out of college, take whatever job you can get just to get by. One thing leads to another, and suddenly you're here. No fancy office, no big dreams, just surviving. Jared felt a tightness in his chest. He had always had a safety net. Doors had opened for him, opportunities handed to him. But he hadn't known what it was like to be left behind, to watch the world move on while you stayed stuck. He didn't know what it was like to feel like you had no choices, no way out. But you had raw talent, Jared said softly, almost to himself. You had something that most people could only dream of. How could you just let it slip away? David gave a half-hearted laugh, shaking his head. It's not that simple. Raw talent doesn't pay the bills when your parents are dying and you're drowning in debt. Brilliance doesn't count when life doesn't care about your potential. It just moves on. And you have to keep up. Jared stared at him, speechless. He had no idea what to say. He had never been in David's shoes, never understood what it meant to be stuck in a situation where nothing seemed to go right. It made him feel guilty. Guilty for the easy path he had been given. Guilty for never having to struggle like this. But you're brilliant, David, Jared said after a long pause. I know that. I've seen it. And I don't think you were meant to be here. You were meant for something bigger. David looked at him, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything for a while, and Jared thought he might have said too much. But then David sighed, a deep, tired sound. I'm not ashamed of what I do, Jared, he said finally. I get by. I do my job. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work. I'm not complaining, I'm just trying to survive. I'm not saying you should be ashamed, Jared said quickly, trying to explain himself. I'm saying you deserve more than this. You deserve a chance to show the world who you really are. David didn't answer. He just gave Jared a small, weary smile, then turned back to his cleaning cart. Jared watched him for a moment, longer, the weight of his words sinking in. There had to be more he could do, something he could offer to change David's life. But what? What could he do to give David the second chance he deserved? As he stood there, Jared knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let this story end like this. Not when he knew what David was capable of. Not when he knew the world had forgotten him. Jared had a chance to fix that. He wasn't going to walk away this time. Jared couldn't shake the image of David mopping the floors of the airport lounge. His mind kept replaying the conversation they had earlier, each word echoing in his head, each moment making him feel more and more unsettled. He had never known someone like David, a person with so much potential, so much talent, yet left to drift through life without the opportunities that others took for granted. It gnawed at him, the injustice of it all. David deserved more than this, and Jared couldn't sit by and do nothing. After hours of wrestling with his thoughts, Jared made a decision. He wasn't going to let David's brilliance be wasted. He couldn't just walk away and forget about it. He knew he had the power to change something in David's life, and he wasn't going to let this moment slip by. He closed his laptop, packed his things, and stood up, walking towards the employee corridor where David had disappeared after their conversation. Jared didn't know exactly what he was going to say, but he knew he had to say something. There was a chance, a slim one, that he could offer David the kind of opportunity he deserved, the kind of life that Jared himself had taken for granted. He found David near the back of the lounge, pushing his cleaning cart along the hallway. The janitor didn't seem surprised to see him, his expression unchanged as Jared approached. "David," Jared called out, jogging a few steps to catch up with him. "I need to talk to you." David paused, turning to face Jared with a raised eyebrow. "What's up?" he asked, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "You didn't board your flight," Jared said, his voice serious. "Why?" "I told you, I'm not going anywhere," David replied, a small laugh escaping his lips. "Just going to clean the floors and keep it moving." Jared shook his head, a sense of urgency building within him. "No, listen. I've been thinking about what you said. I can't stop thinking about it, actually. I don't want to just walk away from this and forget about it. You're better than this, David. You were always better than this." David glanced down at his worn uniform, shrugging his shoulders. "I'm not complaining, Jared. This is what life handed me. No one's fault but mine." "That's not true," Jared said, his voice firm. You had every reason to succeed. You had the talent, the potential, the drive. It's just that life didn't give you the break you deserved. But that's where I come in. David looked up at him, confusion clouding his features. What do you mean? I run a tech company, Jared began slowly. And we need someone who can think outside the box, solve problems like no one else. We're looking for analysts, people who can do more than just crunch numbers. I've seen you solve problems that grown men couldn't even figure out. You deserve to be doing more than this. Jared paused, searching David's face for a hint of hope. I want to offer you a job. I want you to come work with me. David blinked, clearly stunned. Wait, what? You want me to work at your company? Yes, Jared replied, his tone unwavering. We need someone who can think fast, who can solve real-world problems. I know you can do that, David. You were meant for more than this. I'm not offering you charity. I'm offering you a chance to use the skills you've always had. I've seen what you can do, and I believe in you. David shook his head, disbelief etched across his face. You've got to be kidding me. I haven't touched a computer in years, Jared. I haven't even worked in tech since I left school. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, Jared admitted, but I'm offering you a chance to start over. You don't have to do this alone. We'll train you up, give you the tools you need. I know you're rusty, but I also know you're not out of the game. I remember who you are, David. And I want the rest of the world to see that too. There was a long pause. David seemed to be processing everything Jared had said, his mind working to catch up with the sudden turn of events. For a moment, Jared thought he might say no, that he might turn away and keep going with his life as it was. After all, it was easier to keep doing what he knew than to risk trying something new. But then David looked up at him, his eyes searching, filled with hesitation and doubt. Why are you doing this? He asked quietly. What's in it for you? Jared smiled, the answer coming easily. Because I don't want to live in a world where someone like you is forgotten. Because you were always smarter than me, David. And I want everyone else to see that too. David swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. He hadn't expected this, not from Jared, not from anyone. For years he had been invisible, forgotten by a world that didn't care about him anymore. But here was Jared, offering him a chance to rebuild his life, to take control of his future again. Are you sure about this? David asked, his voice low. I'm sure, Jared said with conviction. You've got what it takes, David. I wouldn't offer you this if I didn't believe in you. It was a moment of truth, one that David hadn't expected but had always secretly longed for. A second chance, a shot at redemption, a chance to show the world that he wasn't done yet. Okay, David said quietly, his voice steady now. I'll do it, I'll come work with you. Jared extended his hand and David shook it, a feeling of hope rising within him. This was the moment that could change everything. The moment where David could finally step into the life he was always meant to lead. And for the first time in years, David felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't too late. The following Monday, David stood at the entrance of the sleek glass tower in Midtown, the city's skyline towering above him. The polished exterior of the building seemed to mock him, reminding him of how far he had fallen from the person he once was. He adjusted the borrowed messenger bag slung over his shoulder and tugged at the collar of the only button-down shirt he owned. Everything about this moment felt foreign to him. The world of clean, shining offices, of people in suits who seemed to move with purpose. David took a deep breath and stepped inside. The receptionist barely looked up as he approached. You're here for janitorial services? She asked, her voice flat, not bothering to hide her indifference. David cleared his throat, trying to steady his nerves. No, he said, his voice slightly shaky. I'm an incoming data trainee under Jared Thompson. At that, the receptionist's eyes flickered briefly. Jared's name carried weight, even in places like this. She motioned for him to take a seat, and David sank into the chair, trying to make himself as invisible as possible. His heart raced as he waited for Jared to show up, feeling the weight of judgment that came with being the new guy, the janitor who had somehow ended up in a room full of professionals, When Jared arrived, he greeted David with a firm handshake and a genuine smile, his presence warm and reassuring. The whispers started almost immediately. "Wait, that guy wasn't he?" One person muttered under their breath, but Jared ignored them all. He didn't care about their skepticism. "David," Jared said, his tone strong, "meet your team." The room fell silent. A few people offered tight smiles while others looked at David with barely concealed doubt. David didn't blame them. He felt just as uncertain as they did. He was rusty, slow on the keyboard, unsure of the new platforms he was supposed to learn. His hands shook as he tried to adjust to the unfamiliar world of coding and data analysis. It wasn't long before one of the analysts threw a problem up on the whiteboard, a complex equation about balancing supply chains and predicting trends using artificial intelligence. The team watched David carefully, waiting for him to struggle like they expected. But David stared at the problem, his mind automatically working through the logic. He had once been the best at solving problems like this, even in his sleep. After a few moments, he grabbed the marker and wrote down the solution. It wasn't just correct. It was simpler, cleaner, more efficient than the original. The room fell completely silent as the team absorbed what David had done. For a moment, no one said anything. David could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't back down. This was his moment, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. After a long pause, Jared broke the silence. "This is why we brought him in," he said, his voice filled with pride. "David was the smartest kid I knew. He's the smartest person I know now, and we're lucky to have him here." As the days passed, David continued to prove himself. He made mistakes, yes, but he learned quickly, absorbing new information and applying it in ways that impressed everyone around him. By the end of his first week, Jared invited him to a strategy meeting with the product engineers. They had been skeptical at first, but David's solution to a critical problem in their algorithm shut them all up. Soon, David wasn't just learning from the team. He was leading small projects, mentoring junior analysts, and even making suggestions for new products. His confidence grew with each passing day. He could feel the old fire inside him rekindling, the same fire that had once made him unstoppable in school. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He was doing something. He was making a real impact. But there was always a part of him that hesitated. Every time someone asked where he had worked before, he couldn't help but feel a pang of embarrassment. The truth was hard to swallow. How could he explain to these people, these professionals, that he had spent years pushing a mop in an airport, that he had been forgotten by everyone? It wasn't a story he was proud of, but it was his story. One Friday morning during a company-wide brainstorming session, Jared finally did something that David had never expected. He stood in front of the room and, with no hesitation, introduced David to the team. "This is David Reyes," Jared said, his voice strong. "He was the smartest student in our entire state back in the day, but life happened. He's not here because of pity. He's here because I want the best on my team, and trust me, he's one of the best." There was a long, powerful silence. No one clapped. No one cheered. But then, slowly, someone stood up. "David, would you mind reviewing my new AI loop?" the analyst asked. "I think it's missing something." David nodded, his chest swelling with pride. The respect, the recognition, it felt good. It felt like he had finally earned a place at the table. By the end of the quarter, David had earned a promotion to senior systems strategist. He was now leading bigger projects, designing products, and mentoring junior analysts. But the true measure of his transformation wasn't in his title or his salary. It was in how he saw himself. The boy who had once been ignored, forgotten, now stood at the top of his field, not because of luck, but because he had fought for it. He had earned it. Months later, as David walked through the airport, now dressed in a sharp suit with a polished badge clipped to his jacket, he passed the janitor who had once trained him on floor wax. The man gave him a nod of recognition, but David didn't feel the need to say anything. He had come full circle. "You moved up, huh?" the janitor asked with a knowing smile. David smiled gently, clapping the man on the shoulder. "I didn't move up," he said quietly. "Someone just reminded me I was never supposed to be down here in the first place." And when the invitation came for him to speak at the Science Alliance conference in Boston, David knew it was his time. He was no longer the boy who had been left behind. He was the man who had climbed back up. And now, it was time for the world to see him for who he really was. As he stepped onto that stage, he wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for everyone who had ever been forgotten, for everyone who had been overlooked. His voice was steady as he began. "Genius without support is like a lighthouse with no light bulb," he said, pausing to let the words sink in. "I mopped airport floors for 15 years, and I'm not embarrassed by that, because work is never shameful. But being forgotten, that nearly broke me, until someone remembered." The applause was thunderous, lasting far longer than his speech. But it wasn't about the applause. It was about the journey, the struggle, and the second chance he had been given. And David knew that in the end, it wasn't just Jared who had changed his life. It was his own resilience, his own determination to rise again.